Have you ever noticed that often, right after a sincere prayer, instead of relief, comes more pressure? It's as if the storm increased just when you decided to seek God with more faith. This is one of the most common dilemmas of the Christian life, but almost no one talks about it clearly. Today you will understand why this happens and how this apparent spiritual crisis can actually be the beginning of a great transformation. The truth is that when we pray, we don't just mess with internal feelings, we enter into a true spiritual war. And it is at this moment that the enemy's resistance appears, trying to discourage us. But if we look beyond the surface, we find that even trials are part of a process of spiritual growth, leading to the victory and purpose that God has in store. So, if you've ever wondered, why after praying everything seems to get worse, stay with me until the end of this content. I will show, in the light of the Bible, from the Exodus and Moses' fight against Pharaoh, to texts like Romans 8:28 and James 1:2-4, how God uses even the most difficult situations to strengthen perseverance and lead us to liberation. If you've ever prayed and felt like things got worse, this video is for you. Like now, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs this message. And he comments below, I will not give up my prayer. Who has never knelt in prayer for peace, relief, or direction, and soon afterwards felt as if even greater pressure had fallen on their shoulders? It is as if, instead of clarity, there is more confusion. Instead of rest, an unexpected spiritual crisis. This is a real dilemma that many avoid admitting, but that needs to be understood. Prayer, far from being just a moment of consolation, often becomes the trigger for profound changes. The big question arises, why does it seem that everything gets worse after I pray? This doubt has already echoed in the hearts of simple people and spiritual leaders. It is disturbing because it seems to contradict the idea that seeking God should only bring calm. But what if this initial pressure is not a sign of failure, but the beginning of a transformation? Perhaps it is at this point that the shaken fundamentals begin to give way to something new. Imagine someone who decides to pray more consistently. At first, the days may seem more turbulent. Arguments at home, problems at work, thoughts of giving up. This does not mean the absence of a divine response, but rather the clash between faith and the enemy's resistance. It is as if the act of praying touches hidden wounds that now come to the surface to be treated. This is proof that prayer is not innocuous. It generates movement. It is worth remembering that when we ask God for deliverance, He does not only act around us, but within us as well. Prayer exposes areas that need to be healed and aligned with the divine purpose. And let's face it, this process is not always comfortable. It seems that the heart goes into spiritual warfare, and each trial reveals how much we need trust in God. Discomfort, in this case, can be a sign of spiritual growth. A practical example, someone prays for patience. The next day he faces huge queues, transport delays and difficult people on the way. Coincidence? Difficult. This sequence of trials is often the ground where perseverance flourishes. Pressure does not come to crush, but to mold. And when we understand this, we stop interpreting every difficulty as divine abandonment. The dilemma of prayer, therefore, is not in God's not answering, but in how we interpret the signs. We expect quick and smooth solutions, but often the answer starts with chaos. It's like renovating a house. Before it looks beautiful, you have to break walls, raise dust, live with rubble. In the same way, prayer initiates a process of spiritual reform that at first messes up our routine. When we accept that pressure is part of the process, a new perspective emerges. Praying is not just asking, it is also being willing to undergo the trial that prepares us for victory. There is no way to experience liberation without first facing discomfort. The secret is to remain hopeful and faithful, even when everything seems to get worse. This dilemma ceases to be a burden and becomes a key to spiritual growth. Thus, the question, "Why does everything seem to get worse after I pray?" can turn into another. What is God building in me through this pressure? This look changes everything because it brings purpose to suffering. What once seemed like a senseless spiritual crisis is now revealed as part of God's strategy to lead to victory. And it is at this point that we begin to see prayer not as an immediate relief, but as a path to transformation. The people of Israel knew the weight of slavery. For years, their voices have been raised in prayer for deliverance from the Pharaoh's oppression. They cried out, believing that God could intervene and break those chains. But when the answer began to arrive, it did not come as a breath of immediate relief, but with changes that, at first glance, seemed to aggravate the situation even more. God heard the cry and sent Moses with a powerful message, "Let my people go." This phrase was not just a polite request, it was a divine command that stirred the shaken foundations of Egypt. But, as in any spiritual warfare, the enemy's resistance immediately appeared. Pharaoh not only said no, but he also increased the burden of slavery on the Israelites. Imagine the scene. The people hoping that prayer would bring rest, and instead the forced labor became heavier, the treatment more cruel. It is at this point that many might have thought that God has abandoned them. But in fact, the spiritual crisis that was being established was the preparation for liberation. Before bringing Israel out of Egypt, God needed to pull Egypt out of them. This is a detail that we sometimes forget. Liberation begins in the heart, not in geography. God not only paved the way for the physical exodus, but also stirred the interior of a people accustomed to the routine of oppression. To break with the Pharaoh's system, it was necessary to destabilize the normal of slavery. This discomfort was the trigger for the transformation. When Moses appeared in answer to prayers, the process began with confrontation. The Pharaoh symbolized the resistance of the enemy, the same one who still tries to prevent the spiritual growth of those who decide to pray. That's why Ephesians 6:12 makes so much sense in this context. The fight wasn't just against an earthly king, but against spiritual forces rising up against God's plan. The people, in turn, needed to learn to trust the process, even when everything seemed worse. It was a trial that required faith and perseverance. Each blow of the Pharaoh was also an opportunity for them to see that their hope was not in men, but in God. It was a moment of crisis that in practice became a laboratory of spiritual growth. This episode shows that pressure is often a sign that liberation is near. Pharaoh hardened his heart because he felt he was losing control. And in the same way, today, when we pray and things seem to get worse, maybe it's because invisible chains are already starting to break. Resistance is proof that something great is being released from the sky. The Exodus did not begin with a triumphant march, but with more difficult and seemingly hopeless days. And that's precisely where the secret lies. Victory is born when God takes us out of our comfort zone, showing that prayer is not magic, but the beginning of a profound process of transformation. The story of Moses and the people of Israel remains a reminder that before victory, pressure often mounts. When one bends one's knees in prayer, one is not just uttering words in the wind, is positioning itself on a field of spiritual warfare. That's why Ephesians 6:12 makes it clear, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. To pray is to touch the invisible, and every movement in heaven generates a reaction in hell. No wonder that often, after prayer, the pressure increases. This spiritual confrontation explains why so many people feel that their prayers trigger crises. The enemy does not sit idly by and watch as chains are broken. He reacts, trying to stifle faith, bring doubts, and raise circumstances that shake the foundations of trust in God. Each trial in this context is a reminder that there is a resistance of the enemy against the advancement of faith. Think of a physical battle. When the enemy army realizes that it is losing territory, it reacts more forcefully. Similarly, when someone decides to seek deliverance through prayer, the enemy intensifies the attacks. Family arguments increase, unexpected problems arise, temptations multiply. All this is not a coincidence, but a reflection of an invisible war going on behind the scenes. The big issue is that many people interpret these difficulties as a lack of response. But in fact, they are proof that heaven has already begun to act. What looks like chaos is often the echo of victory approaching. Prayer triggers movements that the natural eye cannot see. Therefore, it is necessary to keep the faith firm, even when the winds blow against it. A practical example: someone decides to pray for the restoration of marriage. At first, more fights, accusations, and hurts arise. It is the enemy trying to destroy before the transformation takes place. If one does not understand the spiritual aspect of this battle, one may give up just as victory was about to manifest itself. Persevering in prayer is, in this case, an act of resistance against the forces that want to steal hope. This understanding changes our attitude. Instead of complaining about the pressure, we start to see it as a sign that we are disturbing the kingdom of darkness. Prayer is not only a conversation with God, it is also a direct confrontation with everything that tries to hinder the purpose. When we accept this, we learn to interpret the spiritual crisis as part of the process and not as a divine failure. It is worth noting that even Moises faced this dynamic. By rising up against Pharaoh, he was not only facing a powerful man, but an entire spiritual structure that supported Egypt. The hardening of the Pharaoh's heart was a reflection of this invisible resistance. In the same way, when we stand up in prayer, we need to be aware that it is not an easy path, but it is a path of transformation. Therefore, giving up cannot be an option. Spiritual warfare can even intensify the pressure, but it also strengthens faith. Every trial is an opportunity to grow, mature, and stand firm. Victory does not come from the absence of struggles, but from perseverance in the midst of them. The enemy resists, but God has already decreed deliverance. Prayer is the thread that connects us to that promise. When the pressure builds right after prayer, the natural tendency is to think that God has forgotten us. But the truth is exactly the opposite. Often the increase in difficulties is a sign that chains are being broken. Pressure is not abandonment, but part of the process of liberation. It is in this crossfire that we learn to differentiate what comes from God and what is resistance from the enemy. It is necessary to remember that God does not waste pain. Every trial has a purpose, even if we don't understand it right away. James 1:2-4 challenges us to consider difficulties as a cause for joy, because they produce perseverance and spiritual growth. It may seem contradictory, but it is precisely in pressure that faith is refined and becomes unshakable. Pressure is like endurance training. Think of an athlete. Without weight, there is no strengthening. Without challenges, there is no evolution. In the same way, spiritual battles serve to prepare us for greater victories. The discomfort we feel is not punishment, but preparation. God uses even the most adverse circumstances to make us stronger. Often we pray for patience, courage, or faith, and God puts us in situations that require exactly these virtues. It seems ironic, but it is divine pedagogy. Learning comes through exercise. The spiritual crisis that arises after prayer is actually the fertile ground where transformation takes place. Each tear can be seen as a seed for the future harvest. It is at this point that trust in God becomes essential. If we look only at the circumstances, we become discouraged. But when we understand that even the shaken foundations are part of a larger plan, a new hope is born within us. It is not a matter of ignoring pain, but of interpreting it as a stage in a process of liberation and victory. A simple example: someone prays for wisdom to better manage finances. Soon after, an unexpected crisis appears. What seems like a setback may actually be the push needed to change habits, learn discipline, and develop responsibility. The pressure, in this case, becomes an opportunity for practical and spiritual growth. The interesting thing is that the pressure is never random. It is directed to shape exactly what needs to be strengthened in us. When we understand this, the perspective changes. The trial is no longer just pain and becomes training. What once seemed like a delay now reveals itself as preparation to carry with maturity the blessing that is to come. Thus, prayer should not be seen as an emergency button to escape from problems, but as an invitation to a profound process of transformation. Pressure pushes us out of our comfort zone and brings us closer to God's purpose. And when we endure the heat of the furnace, we discover that it does not destroy us, but purifies us to live the victory that has already been decreed by God. Israel's story in the Exodus shows that faithfulness, even in the midst of pressure, always bears fruit. After enduring slavery, spiritual crisis, and Pharaoh's resistance, the people left Egypt not empty-handed, but carrying wealth. This detail is striking. Liberation did not come only as an escape, but as a complete victory. In the same way, our perseverance in prayer produces greater results than we imagine. Romans 8:28 confirms this truth. All things work together for good to those who love God. This means that even pain, delay, and trials are part of a divine process. What seems like an unbearable weight today can be the preparation to carry future blessings. God wastes no tears. He transforms each fight into raw material for a greater purpose. When we look back, we often realize that the biggest transformations came from difficult periods. What seemed to be a delay turned out to be progress. What seemed like defeat turned into victory. This is the logic of the kingdom. Faithfulness in the midst of chaos opens doors to experiences that we would never have in times of calm. To persevere is to invest in a future of liberation. A practical example: someone goes through a crisis at work, loses their job, and in the midst of despair continues to pray in faith. After a while, a better opportunity arises, which not only solves finances, but also connects to life purpose. This painful process reveals that God was guiding every detail. The crisis was just a step towards a more solid victory. Faithfulness also breeds spiritual growth. In every trial, we learn to depend less on ourselves and more on God. Perseverance forges character, and molded character makes us more apt to bear greater responsibilities. That is why James 1:2-4 links trials with spiritual maturity. God not only wants to set us free, He wants to prepare us to live to the fullest. It is important to note that victory does not always come the way we expect. Sometimes we pray to get out of the storm, but God teaches us to walk on water. Other times we ask for the removal of the mountain, but He gives us the strength to climb it. Fidelity makes room for surprising experiences, which show us that the result of prayer goes beyond what we ask for. Just as the Israelites came out of Egypt with wealth, we also carry treasures from our struggles. They are not gold coins, but learning, maturity, strengthened faith, and trust in God. These are eternal values that sustain life in any circumstance. Pressure becomes fuel to live under purpose. The end result of faithfulness is to realize that nothing has been in vain. Every tear, every seemingly unanswered prayer, every battle fought in silence contributed to the transformation. Victory may not come at the speed we desire, but it comes in God's perfect timing. And when it comes, we understand that perseverance has always been worth it, because it has brought us even closer to the Father's will. After understanding that prayer can trigger crises, spiritual wars, and even more pressure, the great challenge is how to act in practice. The first step is not to give up. If the storm has increased right after you bend your knees, take it as a sign that something is happening in the spirit world. Persevere, even when everything seems to get worse. Victory may be closer than you think. A simple practice is to transform the moment of trial into an opportunity for even more intense prayer. If you previously prayed 5 minutes, increase it to 10. If you read 1 chapter of the Bible, read 2. This posture is like raising a shield in spiritual warfare, remembering what Ephesians 6:12 teaches us. The enemy resists, but his resistance is no greater than the perseverance of faith. Another practical application is to choose verses to declare daily. Romans 8:28 can be proclaimed as a reminder that everything works together for good. James 1:2-4 can be repeated as an anchor of hope in the midst of trials, and by meditating on these texts, you strengthen the shaken foundations that the enemy tries to destroy, building trust in God even in the darkest hours. It's also helpful to create habits of gratitude in the midst of struggle. Write down 3 reasons to be thankful daily, even in difficult times. This exercise helps you see signs of the ongoing transformation rather than just focusing on the pain. Hope is renewed when we are able to identify small victories in the midst of spiritual warfare. In daily practice, stay connected with people of faith. Sharing your battles in prayer with trusted brothers is like having soldiers by your side. Moses did not face Pharaoh alone. He had Aaron, Miriam, and a people who also cried out. In the same way, we don't have to face our spiritual crises in isolation. Fellowship strengthens when the pressure increases. Another concrete action is to interpret the storm as part of the process. Instead of asking, "Why me?" start asking, "What for?" This shift in perspective brings purpose to the pain and hope to the journey. What seemed like a meaningless weight becomes training to carry something bigger. Trial becomes fuel for spiritual growth. Perseverance can also be practiced in small gestures. If the struggle is financial, continue to be faithful to the principles you already know, such as discipline and generosity. If the struggle is emotional, invest in moments of rest and reading books that feed faith, such as prayer. Key to the Revival by David Yonggi Cho. Every practical choice strengthens trust in God. Finally, don't forget, the answer often starts with chaos. Just as in the Exodus, Pharaoh hardened before giving in, the pressure may be the sign that deliverance is about to manifest. So even when it seems like prayer has made things worse, hold on to hope. Victory may be just one step away, and the next move may be the one that changes your entire story. If you've come this far, you've already realized that prayer is not just asking God for something, but preparing for a process of transformation. The pressure that increases after a prayer does not mean abandonment, but a sign that the sky has moved and the enemy has risen in resistance. Now the big question is, how will you react? Will you give up in the face of the ordeal or stand firm until victory? Think about how many times you've been on the verge of giving up, and a short time later, you've seen an unexpected response arrive. Isn't today exactly that time when your faithfulness is being tested? The spiritual crisis may just be proof that liberation is closer than you think. What if, instead of fearing pressure, you started to see it as a sign of progress? Have you ever wondered if the shaken foundations that bother you so much today are, in fact, the basis of something new that God is building? Perhaps the question is no longer, why is this happening to me, but what is God forging within me? Now I ask you, what area of your life needs perseverance in prayer? Where have you been feeling the most spiritual warfare? What place looks like an Egypt, where Pharaoh insists on not letting you go? Answering these questions can be the first step in aligning your faith with divine purpose. Don't forget, Romans 8:28 assures us that all things work together for good to those who love God. Even this struggle you face today will be used for your spiritual growth. The question is whether you will stand firm until you see victory manifest itself. So choose to trust, pray, persevere, declare the word, and be unfazed. Deliverance, as in the Exodus, may seem time-consuming, but it is on the way. Hope is the flame that keeps faith burning until the miracle happens. Now reflect. Are you willing to keep praying even when everything seems to get worse? What needs to change in your attitude in the face of trials? And if this message spoke to you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who also needs this word of hope. Together, we can endure until we experience the victory that God has already prepared.